As we continue through our journey through Torah, we come then to the first book of Torah, which of course we call Genesis. Now, of course, Genesis is not Hebrew. Genesis is Greek. Genesis means in the beginning of, or the birth of. In fact, in Hebrew, the name for Genesis is actually Bereshit. Bereshit. And the way in which the Old Testament, or at least particularly Torah, names their books is they name it by virtue of the first words that are written in the book. And the first word in Genesis is the word Bereshit, in the beginning. And so what we have there is really the story of the prehistory of Israel. So right from the time of creation, you know that Genesis 1 is the first creation story. Genesis 2 is the second creation story. Genesis 3 is the fall, or the sin, or whatever you want to call it, within the Garden of Eden. And then Genesis 4 onwards shows getting kicked out, and Noah, and the Tower of Babel, and all those others, prehistory. So the stories that are before the time of writing and of history. And then from Genesis 12 onwards, we start seeing the story of Abraham. And then you have the story of the patriarchs. So Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then sometimes also Joseph is called a patriarch as well. But it's not just Joseph, it's Joseph and his 11 brothers that now get involved in that story. And so really, Genesis is a beginnings book. It's a book that's all about the beginnings of the people of Israel. In fact, the beginnings of humankind as a whole. But what we need to hold on to here is, as I said in the previous clip, Genesis chapter 1 is written a long time after Genesis chapter 2. Now, most people might think, well, why don't we start with Genesis 2? Well, of course, Genesis 2 says we were made from the dust of the earth. The soil of the earth is where we came from. But a lot of the Jews by this stage were now away from that place of origins, away from that dust of origins. And so what they were doing was to say, well, how do we really understand our relationship with God? And so I want to emphasize to you that Genesis chapter 1 is really the focal point of everything else that happens in Tanakh. Everything else that happens in Tanakh, and by virtue of that, everything that we need to understand about the New Testament comes out of Genesis chapter 1 as well. And so what is that? What is the point that Genesis chapter 1 is trying to make? Well, it leads us through the various days, right up to the 6th day of creation. And when we get to the 6th day of creation, we reach that pinnacle of creation. Now, I want to emphasize here that man is not the pinnacle of creation by virtue of somehow being better than the animals, or somehow being higher than the animals. No. The difference that between mankind or humankind and the animals is not about our sense of superiority, but rather our ability, the potential that God has placed within humankind. And it's that potential, that reality that placed within humankind that really sets up the rest of the Tanakh. And what is that? In Latin, and of course all good doctrines always have a Latin name, it's called the Imago Dei. That's the Latin for the image, of God. The image of God. And it's that which was placed into humanity, which sets us apart from the animals. It doesn't make us higher than the animals. It doesn't make us better than the animals. It sets us apart from the animals. It's about saying that we have a job to do, a particular job, a job that we can only do by virtue of the fact that we are made in the image of God. That we're saying that the animals are not less than us, are not worthy of less respect because they are somehow made before us. But rather saying that in fact we were given a special task by virtue of becoming the image of God. We were made in His image. Now what does that mean? Obviously it's not about our physicality. It's not about our physical appearance. In fact, the easiest thing that we can do to understand the concept of the image of God is to understand, well, where else does it tell us who God is? What is God? If we made in His image, what is God? Or who is God? Now, of course, the Bible tells us quite clearly that we can never really know who God is. In fact, we can never really know what God is. For God is the other, the complete other. Yet in 1 John, John wants to address this concept of who God is. And he uses that wonderful phrase, God is love. That God is love. Not that God loves us or that God is loving, but rather God is love. So if we embody love, if we think of something that is pure love, then we begin to have an insight into God. It's why Paul spends so much of all these letters trying to define love. 1 Corinthians 13, in Galatians 5, in each of those sections, Paul is trying to grapple with, well, if God is love, what is love? And how do we understand that? And I think that's really, when we look at Tanakh, when we look at the New Testament, that's really what it's about. It's about trying to define the indefinable, to define that which is the unknowable, but to know only by virtue of experience. However, we can say, therefore, that if God is love, then the image of God which is placed within us is both the ability and the need for love. And that's what sets us apart, is not only the ability to love, but the ability to choose to love in return. And that's really where we have then the responsibility to the world, the responsibility to animals, not to see them as somehow less than us, but actually to look after them, to love them, to care for them, and therefore also to do that to other human beings. So you see how that concept of being made in the image of God then sets up everything else in the rest of the book of Genesis. And not only Genesis, but through the rest of Torah into the rest of Tanakh. And once we get hold of that, all of a sudden we realize that the Bible is about love because it's about God, and God is love.